We found that in terms of overall production by volume, France was definitely the leader for fiber hemp. And again, the hemp can be used, that fiber hemp can be used for apparel, it can be used for it can be used for animal bedding. It's a fiber crop. But we found that it was mostly France, followed quite distantly by China and the US, and interestingly, North Korea.
That's Sandra Marquardt from Textile Exchange. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock, and today I will be talking to Sandra about Textile Exchange and about their focus on hemp and about their recently published report that's called Growing Hemp for the Future, a Global Fiber Guide. This report looks at global hemp production, fertilizer use, pesticide use, and makes some recommendations on how hemp can develop and maintain that cool cachet of sustainability. So all that and more on today's show, but first we'll have a quick word from our sponsors. Today's show is brought to you with generous support from IND Hemp in Fort Benton, Montana, where they believe in the goodness of hemp. They also believe that hemp grain is a really good feed for animals. And so they're asking you to support the Hemp Feed Coalition. The HFC is working really hard to make hemp grain a legal livestock feed for commercial production. So go to hempfeedcoalition.org to learn more. Today's show is also brought to us with support from Amerishawn Cast Hemp here in Pennsylvania. This is Cameron McIntosh's hemp construction company. Get in touch with Cameron and start making your hempcrete dreams a reality today. Okay, welcome back. So we've got a couple of things to talk about before we get into my interview with Sandra from Textile Exchange. A couple of news nuggets here. The first is there was a hearing last week up on Capitol Hill. It was a House Oversight Committee hearing that was called Hemp in the Modern World, the Years-Long Wait for FDA Action. The hearing was led by Congresswoman Lisa McClain, a Republican from Michigan's 9th District. Here she is starting off the hearing.
I want to welcome everyone today. We are here yet again to discuss the failures of the Food and Drug Administration. Earlier this year, the subcommittee learned how failures at the FDA led to the infant formula crisis. Now we are learning that the FDA's failure to regulate hemp products. In both cases, the FDA's action, or quite frankly, lack thereof, have hurt families and children.
Yeah, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but yeah, everyone's waiting for the FDA to do something or say something or to make a ruling. And it's affecting not just the CBD people, but it affects the hemp as a livestock feed conversation. And it even affects some consumer products that use hemp. And it's crazy because all of this sort of hinges around the cannabinoid content. And what frustrates me is that there's no cannabinoid content in the fiber that's used for consumer products, and there's no cannabinoid content in the grain that would be used as a livestock feed. Anyway, so I will put a link to the whole hearing up on the show page for this episode so you can go and watch it. But it seemed like a missed opportunity because they didn't really have anyone representing the fiber and grain side of things. So, whatever. Anyway, moving on. I found an interesting story on WCFcourier.com. This is sort of an ag newspaper out of Iowa, I think. But it's a story about feral cannabis, ditchweed, and why it can be found throughout Iowa. So I'll put a link to that on the show page for this episode too. Before we get into the interview today, I just want to acknowledge the passing of someone who had a really profound impact on not just the hemp space in Pennsylvania, but people in Pennsylvania. I'm talking about Chris Lloyd. He was the founder of Dawn Services. That's the organization out in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, out in western PA, that built the Project PA Hemp Home. Chris Lloyd was a passionate advocate for people with disabilities and people in general, and his passion and love for people brought him to industrial hemp, and he saw it as a way to improve the lives of people. So I just wanted to acknowledge his passing and offer my condolences to his family and the folks at Dawn Services, especially Lori Daytner and Phil Berezniak. Chris's legacy will live on in the good work that they're doing at Dawn Services. Sandra Marquardt from Textile Exchange. Welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be on your show.
Yeah, good. Well, welcome. I wonder if you could first give us a very brief introduction.
Yeah, hi. I'm the senior manager of fiber crops for Textile Exchange. And Textile Exchange itself is a global organization that works with brands, manufacturers, farmers around the world, obviously, towards a more purposeful production method right from the start.
Okay. So describe your role there at Textile Exchange.
My role has been really to work on natural fibers. I also work on cotton issues and identify their benefits, their concerns, work with some of the brands, and again, the entire supply chain to just make the entire program more sustainable. We have our goal really is this Climate Plus focus, which is looking at the reduction of greenhouse gases in particular in the textile sector. The textile sector is quite a large emitter of greenhouse gases, so we're trying to look at that, but only at what we call the tier 4 level, which is the in-field level. So that's been really, really interesting to just try to dive into the weeds to see how's cotton grown, how's hemp grown, how's flax grown. But we also tackle a number of different fibers and materials, including animal fibers, so alpaca, cashmere, wool.
Yak hair.
Yak hair. I haven't gotten into yak hair, but it is one.
It's out there, yeah.
Jute. And also man-made cellulosics like lyocell. We look at synthetics, trying to get people to use recycled polyester instead of virgin polyester. So we work on a variety of fibers and materials, but focusing on the major ones that are going to make a difference.
So where are you based? And tell me about like the size of the organization. Like, is it a great big team worldwide at Textile Exchange?
I personally am based just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, but Textile Exchange is an all virtual organization. We have no headquarters. So we're all in, I believe, 30 different countries around the world. There are about 140 of us now. We've tripled in size. There is such huge demand on the part of brands in particular, trying to figure out how to green their supply chains. So they're really turning to us to say, how do we do it? What do we do? What are the materials we use?
Right. How to green the supply chains without greenwashing the whole thing.
That's an outstanding
that's a
point.
trick.
It's
Yeah.
really, really vital. So we actually have a group of standards that we're merging into one set, but we have 8 different standards that address organic cotton use or animal fiber use, etc., the recycled polyester use. So we're going to merge those all into one, and those are all going to work towards a pinnacle of goals that will really help the industry in their drive for green. But it's very important for brands to become certified to standards so that they are not greenwashing.
Right. So you've recently published a report called Growing Hemp for the Future, a Global Fiber Guide. So what was the purpose of this report? Just sort of give us a little introduction to it.
Yeah, thanks. The title kind of gives it away. Hemp is a great fiber, but if we don't look at how it's grown, we can't use its powers to really address the future, address how the industry is using fibers materials that are causing greenhouse gas emissions, or using pesticides and fertilizers that might be contaminating our air and water. So it's really talking about how can we grow this incredible crop for the future.
Right. Okay. Because it's like if you look at other industries and how they've evolved over the decades and centuries, you wouldn't ever design them that way, right? It's like you look at these things like, how did it turn out that way? But with hemp, it's like we have this, once in a lifetime opportunity to design the system, right? And design it the way it can reach its maximum potential, right? And that's sort of what you're going for here, is trying to like set out.
You're hitting the nail on the head. Absolutely. In every other crop, they're trying to backtrack. Corn, cotton, wheat, soy, they're all looking at their pesticide nitrogen use and going, what are we going to do? They're all setting that these sectors are all setting restrictions on what should be used, how should we grow it, but they're all backpedaling. And I'm trying to say, we have this unique opportunity here to forward pedal on a really nice bike, where where we can decide as an industry how this should be grown, how hemp should be grown. And it's almost like an experiment. Like, again, going back to these other crops where they're trying to now do a little bit of research, at least into organic or sustainable research. We're at this stage now where with other crops, they're kind of starting the research into non-toxic methods of pest management. We can do that from the beginning. These other crops are being tossed bones. The focus has been on how do you drive maximum sales of pesticides and fertilizers and make a lot of money for the chemical industries. As a result, a lot of these crops have become dependent on these inputs. But hemp is it's in such a polar opposite situation. When we looked at how many pesticides are registered for use on hemp around the world, and this was not an exhaustive research, but we went to the major countries like China, Poland, Turkey, US, and we looked to see how many pesticides are registered. And it's like China doesn't have any. Turkey doesn't have any. I mean, how cool is that? They've got we've got a multi-billion-dollar global industry already that's based on a crop that is not using any pesticides in key production countries. But the problem is...
I have a question there. Sorry.
Yes.
In those countries, they're just not using any of those pesticides, or are they using them and not reporting them?
Oh, that's a good point. I'm not on the ground in those countries, so all I can say is when we look at the government lists about that track which pesticides can be used, it shows up as none. So they're not authorized. Whether they're using something is another question, but they're not authorized to.
Okay, so you're about to. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You're about to tell me the problem is.
The problem is that some countries are moving ahead with their pesticide authorizations. So, for example, the Netherlands has authorized, I think it's 25 different pesticides, and several of these are considered highly hazardous. This includes the herbicide glyphosate, which most people know as Roundup. Glyphosate is already the largest herbicide sold worldwide. There are a lot of concerns about it. Some people say it's a carcinogen, some say it doesn't, it's not, but there are concerns with it. There are also concerns around these other highly hazardous pesticides. But so long as that barn door is open, the chemical industry will walk in. And that is where we need to be strong. That's where the hemp industry, I think, needs to be strong. Do you want to drink that Kool-Aid, or do you want to spit it out and say there's another way of doing this? Okay? It is so amazing to have, even the United States of America, where hundreds of pesticides are registered for use on different fiber and food crops. But even here, 45 biological pesticides are registered for it and only one conventional one. And that got registered this year. So again, this barn door is opening, and we have to figure out, do we want to open it wide, close it? Do we want to see how can we grow hemp right from the beginning?
Right. I know, just talking to farmers in general, that they look at herbicides and pesticides as just some of the tools that they use. I mean, granted, I know a lot of regenerative farmers who don't use the synthetic fertilizers and whatever, but I imagine there's some farmers out there being like, well, wait a minute, there's not going to be anything I can use for this, and that sort of like maybe puts them at a disadvantage. But I don't know what
or an advantage.
Right.
Now I hear you. It's definitely harder. It's definitely easier. It's definitely easier to reach for Roundup and blow out those herbicides, those weeds. And I would say, just backtracking a second, an herbicide is a pesticide. So a pesticide is anything that kills a pest. A pest can be that weed, an insect, fungus. It can actually be a defoliant, whatever. The question we have is, do we want to blanket? They call it like what did they call what was the word? Not a blowdown.
Burn down.
Burn down.
When they do the burn down, yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, a company can do a burn down in the field. I thought that was burning. No, it's using Roundup or another crop to nuke the area before you put in your nice little organic hemp. It's just an oxymoron. Now, I realize I'm not farming thousands of acres of hemp. So this is exactly the point where we say to the research sector, can you focus the majority of your efforts on how do we get that same clean field without the use of herbicides or whichever kind of pesticide it is? And there are farmers already doing that.
Right.
That's the exciting thing. It can be done, but it's going to be a problem. As more hemp is grown, more pests will raise their heads. So this is why we just need to do the inverse for research than what we've done, where the research has invariably been on which chemicals can we turn to do a quick spray, even by drone, whatever, get it done, get the hemp in the field, get whatever product in the field, but at what cost?
Right. I'm excited by the idea of no-till farming, no-till, regenerative, organic, all that stuff, where we're not even tilling the fields. We can just plant into like a green manure. And because you want to keep the life, the microbes in the soil. Yeah. We want all those little critters in there to be happy. And if you're burning it down, once a season, just like, out in Montana last week, we saw those great big gray fields that were, I guess the term they use is chemically fallowed. They just spray them and they kind of coat them to hold the moisture in. Mm-hmm. And then, the following year they'll plant, or like later later in the season, they'll plant some kind of wheat or something. But yeah, even here in Pennsylvania, you drive around and you see these farm fields that have just been, burned down, and they're just, it's springtime, but the fields are dead, and you're like, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's really hard. And this is where research needs to go into. It has to be done on a regional basis. For example, production in Pennsylvania is going to be far different from production in Montana, where there's so much less moisture. So or Texas, the question is how, if we use cover crops, does that take away all our water? But again, this comes down to research. How do we make this happen? How do we visualize it? How do we put on our biggest and best thinking caps and figure it out in a manner that doesn't cause cancer?
So there's a lot at stake.
There's a lot at stake. We're talking about, like, say with the cotton sector alone, in 2021, there were about 100 different pesticides used on it for millions, tens of millions of pounds of just the active ingredient, not to even include the entire formulation. There were billions, and there's almost 1 billion pounds of fertilizers alone. That's just for one crop. Then you look at soy and corn, which use even more. So does hemp want to join that crowd, or do we want to make that, frankly, what the consumers are expecting, which is kind of a cool crop that's done the right way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about the report itself. Tell me sort of how it was structured, who wrote it, any methodologies in your research you want to talk about?
Yeah. It's been an interesting report because we had to, we want to do a global focus. We wanted to, and I worked globally with my colleagues around the world. But I spearheaded the report basically because we were getting more inquiries around hemp than any other fiber material, which was a real surprise to me. But we just kept on getting questions and we needed to answer them. We wrote a short summary document. That wasn't enough. So we said, let's really think about, let's go into the weeds and really think about where is fiber hemp even grown? Is China the number one producer or not? Then we looked into which pesticides are authorized for use on it. And we looked at which standards could be used for it. So if you want to say, yeah, I grow sustainable hemp, then what does that mean? So in terms of the worldwide production, what I thought was very interesting was that we were under the opinion that that China was number one for everything, but really it's not. It's definitely a major player, but France is number one for overall production. But the United States plays a big role there. We're up, in the definitely top 10, if not fifth. Let me see. We're number 5 for overall production. That was in 2021. So that was just really exciting to just see who are the players. Who else is in there? Where's Lithuania? Where's Romania? But that's where the plot thickened. And it was really, really fascinating to see how hard it was to get data. For example, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, they have a chart that they maintain for annual overall production quantities, area, and yields for hemp. But for some reason, they didn't include countries like the United States, even though we have publicly available data. And in some other countries, they mentioned that there were thousands of acres in Chile, and I contacted my Chilean colleagues, and they said, no, there might be 10 acres. So the data is not accurate, and so I say at the very beginning that this is inaccurate, inadequate, but it's intriguing and interesting.
Sure, right. It's amazing to think, you said the U.S. is kind of in like the top 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because our industry is so
small.
So new, but then
exactly.
The whole worldwide industry is so small. Like if we can be a major player just, after a few years out of the gate.
Absolutely. We have a huge opportunity. And what I thought was so exciting about like the Montana conference and then the North Carolina NC State conference the week before is that companies want to share. It's really a beautiful day when companies say, wow, where are you sourcing from? How's it going for you in China? I know, who are your suppliers in France? And people willingly say, I mean, that's the way it should be. It should be a collaborative process. I mean, I know I'm thinking, pie in the sky, but that's what's going to help this product expand.
Right. Yeah, we have to be bold in our imaginations or we're never going to get the world that we want, right?
Bold and transparent.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, and then I thought we would sort of like just go through the report, maybe chapter by chapter, and I can, ask you a couple of things about that. But first, I wonder if you can just compare and contrast hemp to other textile materials.
We look more at the field level. Now, obviously, it's a sturdy and hardy crop. People have found that it's very durable. That's one of the reasons why Patagonia and other companies are incorporating it into their products. People love the aesthetics of it, although they like the fact that they can either have it 100% or they can blend it. And often that blend is with 100% organic, with 8% of organic cotton or silk or lyocell or wool or whatever the fiber can be. But it's a very, very flexible fiber in that way.
Okay.
And that's just for the textile sector. I mean, the fact that what we were hearing about its use in cars and in building construction, I mean, that's a whole nother world.
Right. But you're my textile expert, so we're talking textiles. Yeah. And so just to, maybe we touched on this already, but what are the dangers of letting the industry develop willy-nilly?
I think there are two. One is that it will become another crop that is just contributing more greenhouse gases, more toxic pesticides and fertilizers to the land, and it'll just become another crop. And that's fine. People can still get their hemp or they can get their hemp clothes, but at what cost? So that's really a key point. The second key point, however, is right now hemp is considered cool. It's got this cool cachet. Hey, I got a hemp shirt on. Everybody kind of smiles and says that's really cool. I mean, I've heard that it's really sustainable and doesn't use any pesticides on it. And what if that changes? Then what's the story going to be? I've got another fiber. It's just at some point it can become another fiber, and who knows if the consumers are going to want it anymore. They could move on to something else, which could be synthetic.
So you're talking about like maintaining the brand identity of this crop,
I think you hit the nail on the head. It really is. I call it the cool cachet, how it sounds, but it is the brand identity. You totally nailed it.
Because I'm still waiting for, like the general population of consumers in America to demand that all of their consumer products be made out of sustainably sourced material, right? And for me, like agriculture should be the source of all of our consumer products, not just textiles, but the bioplastic, like everything. Our farmers can do that. So that's where I'm coming from.
It's very important, but it brings up two different points.
Okay.
One is that you mentioned no-till before. No-till is a very cool concept, unless it's no-till done in a conventional manner, which means that you just
burn down.
Can use any pesticide that you want, basically, and that's a problem. So I think that the pesticide angle really is key to all of this.
Sure.
If you grow your soy, if you grow your corn-based fibers, your biosynthetics, again, how are you growing it? It all comes back to the beginning. How's it grown? But the problem is that people don't think that. They're thinking about, how do I get this for $6? They just want something that looks kind of cute and may last 2 times, but...
Right. Yeah, I mean, people are kind of distracted by, their phones, media, their financial issues. There's so much pulling on people's attention that, how do you actually get people to care that, our consumer behavior is essentially leading to climate change? There's more to it than...
don't even believe that there is climate change. And that's the whole thing, is how do you get people to care when they don't think there's a problem? Now, one of the things that hit me over the head when we were out in Montana was going to Glacier National Park. I went there right before going to this conference, and I had my presentation all prepared. It was just like a nice presentation. My first stop at Glacier National Park was at this huge, it was at a sign for what used to be a huge glacier. And it just stopped me. It just blew me away. The sign that even the government park, the National Park Service had there was showing that in the last 100 years alone, they've lost 2/3 of their glaciers. They're just in retreat at an exponential rate. And it was at that point that I was just like, this is not just a presentation at a conference. This is a call to action. It's a call to action that really needs to go out far and wide, which is why I'm so excited to talk with you, because you have the voice of so many. We have to take action because we don't have a choice. Things are changing, and they're changing fast. We're going to be affected. Our kids are going to be affected. Their kids are going to be affected. What can we do? This continues, like not only in the field, but even once you get it off the field, the first stages of processing, for example, well, even in the field, the tractors are run by diesel. You go to the processing plants, they're run by coal. We just need to kind of think about the entire process, especially with hemp. How do we make it as sustainable as possible so that people will sustain their interest in it?
Right. Did you meet Greg Wilson from Hempwood out in Montana?
I did.
So his facility in Kentucky, their power comes from hydro, and they also use their waste material in their kilns. So it's like, he says it's a carbon negative facility, which is a great model. And I think, other people could be learning from that.
I totally think so. I think that Greg has done amazing things with the entire flooring industry. Who would have thought about that a couple of years ago? I would go back, though, that it gets sticky because he's using soy. Okay, soy is very pesticide and fertilizer intensive. So every step along the way, we just have to figure out how do we do it and how do we do it better.
Did you have an aha moment around hemp? Like, did it occur to you recently that hemp was a good idea, or like what was your sort of journey into hemp?
My journey was really getting all these emails from brands around the world saying, tell us about it. We're using it. We want to use it, but we don't know anything about it. What can you tell us? So I didn't really just have an aha moment. It was more like, I come at it from a different perspective. It's show me how, or show me why I should say aha. And I ask myself that every day. what are these companies, what are the farmers, what are the brands doing to make me say, aha, this is really cool. Now that does hit me when I'm in the fields. When I went down to NC State just 2 weeks ago, and we were all standing around these fields where they were growing their own nitrogen with, crimson clover and hairy vetch. I mean, that is cool. They were getting their entire 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre from a natural source that hadn't been sprayed. That's when I say, aha. I want to say, aha. But right now, my aha is kind of getting suppressed sometimes because sometimes it's hemp at any cost. And that is what I think is really, really important. Do we want hemp at any cost? Is it just another thing to market? Or are we all going to say, aha, man, what can I do?
Right. Like, can it be the paradigm shifting material
Absolutely.
that a lot of people hope it is?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about the report. Sure. It's sort of like, there's 9 different, maybe 10 different chapters. And the first is sort of an introduction, and you use the phrase, hindsight is foresight. Can you talk just a bit about what you mean there?
Absolutely. With hindsight being foresight, that's really looking, I got that phrase, I stole that phrase from Mark Dwyer at Patagonia. And it floored me when he said that. It really is looking at how many billions of pounds of pesticides and fertilizers are we using on other crops, and how do we not do that with hemp? How do we grow it right from the beginning? So that's when we started looking. In fact, then I did have a kind of a fun aha moment with when I was scrolling through LinkedIn one night, and I saw this incredible quote from Ken Elliott, who's the CEO and founder of IND Hemp in Montana. And
I will say that, I'm sorry, Morgan is now the CEO. Ken is the founder. He's stepping aside
he's
to
founder.
Keep the facts straight.
Yeah, he's the founder and owner. You're right.
Yeah.
Okay. He wrote, if we are going to create change that will provide meaningful improvement to our environment, we're not going to be able to use the same agricultural practices that got us into this mess. And when I see the owner of a company say something like that, it is so brave. It's putting a stake in the sand and saying, let's do this right. And so I was really excited about that. That's really the angle that we got into.
Right. Okay. Yeah, Ken's one of my favorite people in the hemp space and possibly the entire world. And yeah, that guy can draw a great line in the sand. And he talks about
Very
like,
brave.
What's your hill to die on? And he is committed. He's got faith. In that, like, this is coming. So, yeah.
And they're going to also have to figure out, what does regenerative mean to them, because they're using organic and regeneratively grown fiber. But right now, and we can talk about this later, but right now, regenerative is not really a defined word. And so it's going to be up to IND Hemp to really be a driver there too. What are the parameters that we will accept? What are the outcomes that we want to see?
Right. Well, that's what outcomes. Heard Steve Groff on a farmer panel out in Montana talking about outcomes. It's like regenerative in Pennsylvania is going to look way different than regenerative in Montana. You're going to have different practices, but hopefully you're going to achieve the same outcomes, which is, continually improving your soil and your output. So, yeah.
That's absolutely hitting the nail on the head.
In the second chapter is sort of about key findings, which you then get into in more detail. But I wonder if you could talk about the LCA, which is a life cycle analysis, and this idea that it's not possible to account for carbon sequestration if the carbon is sequestered for less than 100 years. So first explain what LCA is, and then explain this 100-year thing.
An LCA is a life cycle analysis where companies are increasingly using that tool to look at the impact of the fibers and materials that they're using from the cradle to the grave. So from the time that the seed is planted to the finished product. In the past, they're very expensive. A lot of the LCAs have at least been more expensive. Now it might be coming down, but the hitch with LCAs is that, well, the benefit rather of LCAs is that they're going to force companies to look down to literally the granular level as to how their fiber is grown, because you're looking at the entire picture from seed to finished product. Okay. So that's really important. They're going to be looking at the greenhouse gases, they'll look at their pesticide use, they'll look at their nitrogen use, et cetera. They'll look at whether there's been any beneficial outcomes in the soil, et cetera. But at this time, companies cannot make a claim that carbon has been sequestered into their shirt, for example. And that's because shirts don't last a minimum of 100 years. So the cutoff right now is like, if carbon is sequestered into the crop and into the soil, will it stay there for 100 years? What kinds of claims can I make? That jury is still out right now. That literally this year, the guidelines are supposed to be coming into place that will help companies figure out exactly what they can claim. But the main point is that if the carbon isn't sticking around for a long time, you better not claim that it is.
Right. Well, I like the idea of the life cycle analysis. Well, I mean, I get frustrated because, I'm home, I'm in my house, I'm unwrapping food and it's all wrapped in packaging and plastic and cardboard. And then suddenly I'm responsible for taking all that stuff out and I separate it into recycling and some goes into the trash. And over the course of my life, I've seen, great big, landfills rise up where there had been valleys. And it's like at a certain point, aren't the companies manufacturing the things, shouldn't they be responsible for that? I don't know. I think back like the old days when, you would buy returnable bottles. You would drink the product and then return them. I don't know. I feel like we can do better.
This is absolutely the direction that ultimately the hemp industry will also need to address. Right now, it's just get it into the soil, grow the hemp. But ultimately, brands are looking for circularity. They're looking to see how you can return that. So, for example, recycled cotton is probably our next most popular crop question. People are trying to say, how do we recycle cotton? How do we use it again? How do we collect it? So the beauty of hemp is that all parts of the plant can be used. I mean, it's really incredible. But again, what happens once it's out there? What happens also about how do you blend it? How do you choose your fiber or material to blend it with so that it will break down faster if possible? The problem with discarding any product, however, is that landfills off gas or the product just stays there and can't go away. I mean, there's that whole statement about, is there an away? There is no away. It's going to be somewhere. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's so important, though. If brands are going to start looking into hemp for textiles, it's really important to create a fiber blend that can be recycled the most easily. The more that it's blended with synthetic fibers, for example, fiber and synthetics, that just makes it harder. So you have to, again, go back to the beginning. It all comes back to the beginning. It's the designer, it's the farmer, it's the brand, but you have to go back to the very beginning. How are we going to do this right?
Right. And again, like it's an exciting time because you never get to design an industry like this. Like we've usually just inherited them. But here we are
That's
at the beginning
of
Yeah. All right. So back to the report. So chapter 3 is kind of like background on hemp. There's some really interesting information in there. I'm just going to skip through some things and get to some meatier topics here. In chapter 4, it's like benefits and concerns. And I think we've talked about some of those benefits and concerns already, but is there anything else you'd like to highlight there?
No, I think that the primary benefits are literally how wonderful it is for the soil. It's got this deep taproot. It can do phytoremediation remediate for chemicals, radiation, and metals in the soil. I mean, how cool is that? Now we have to figure out what to do with that hemp once it's contaminated itself. But it has these incredible physical properties. But then the concerns really do come down to the potentially increasing use of pesticides, and the fact that the recommendations for fertilizer use are the same as for, say, corn, cotton, and soy. And those are all pretty intensive users of fertilizers. And these fertilizers, they can not only cause greenhouse gas depletion, but they can also get into our waterways, into our air. it just, we need to figure out how to do this. How do you address the weed problem, the problem, or the insect problem, or the fungus problem, the snail problem, whatever it is, the grasshopper problem? How do you do it? How do you address it in a way that doesn't cause harm?
Right. And then you think about, humans, right? And we've been around for a while. We've been farming for a while. But we've only had, like modern industrial farming for, let's say, 100 years or so, right? So we clearly survived, and some would say thrived before that time. But like, how do you, I don't know, put the genie back in the bottle or whatever? Like, how do we, I don't know. It's an interesting spot we're in.
I think what a lot of companies want to do is they don't want us to just survive. They want us to thrive. So if you can grow 100 crops, or if you're 100 pounds per acre, can we grow 1,000 pounds per acre? Things like that. The issue of how do we make hemp a commodity crop, which like corn, cotton, soy? How do we genetically modify it? These are all questions that came up at the conference. They're big questions for this nascent industry to address. And that's what was so important about this Montana conference and the preceding North Carolina conference, is that people are finally starting to address that. And it's pretty darn early on. The other sectors, the other crops weren't really talking about that until recently. Here we are in a very nascent stage, and we're already talking about it, but we have to keep the conversation going. Amen
to that. So you mentioned a little bit about pesticide use around the world and production around the world. You touched on that France is actually the biggest hemp producer in the world, not China, and which is because I think everyone, they think, oh, China, they never stopped growing hemp. They're probably but it's France. And is that for textiles, or is that for all industrial hemp?
We were just looking at textiles in this case, so we were only looking at fiber hemp. Okay. We did not look at food hemp hemp for any other purpose. So we're just looking for looking at fiber hemp. Although you're right, it can be used for textiles. It can be used for anything else. So you're totally right. We found that France was definitely the largest producer. We found that in terms of overall production by volume, France was definitely the leader for fiber hemp. And again, the hemp can be used, that fiber hemp can be used for apparel. It can be used for it can be used for animal bedding. It's a fiber crop. But we found that it was mostly France, followed quite distantly by China and the US, and interestingly, North Korea. Now, I thought this was very interesting, and then Poland came after that. So those are the 5 top countries by volume. Now, keep in mind, this is United Nations data, and in the North Korea data was based on estimates. But North Korea actually led also for production by area. They led France. So it was North Korea, France, China, US, and Germany. Again, the US is a big player, so this is exciting. What I thought was kind of fun, though, is when you look at yields, those countries are not necessarily the largest by yield. Italy was. Who even knew? I mean, Italy didn't rank very high on any other crop, but suddenly it really came to the forefront. So you had Italy and the Netherlands were literally neck and neck in terms of their yields, but they were hugely ahead of anybody else, including Poland, China, and the United States.
Any idea why that is? Is that, growing methods or what?
I have absolutely no clue. I'm just going to assume that the data is even accurate. But what I thought was very interesting is that there is a role for smaller players. Yep. If it's grown right, then anyone can participate.
Can you talk about...
And sorry, if I could interrupt there.
Yeah, sure.
I thought it was actually interesting. If you look at the United States, some of our production in North Carolina and in Missouri equates to what some of these other countries, top 5 countries, are doing. So we are an important player. The United States is a very important player here. And so what we decide about how hemp's going to be grown here, that's going to have an impact around the world.
Right, because we're not going to stay a smaller producer. We're going to become a bigger producer.
There's a lot of interest in expanding production exponentially.
Right, because this crop can disrupt so many different industries, not just textiles, but, like you name it.
But I think not only that, another way that it can disrupt is by disrupting weed populations in subsequent crops. I think that is ultra cool. If we think about the fact that growing hemp before corn, soy, wheat, and hopefully cotton can actually boost yields while reducing herbicide use. I mean, that is ultra cool. And it can translate into tens of millions of pounds of herbicides, in particular, that wouldn't be used if we just plant hemp in advance. That is a mammothly impressive point, I think. I mean, how cool is that you can use a crop to suppress weeds next year?
It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, crop is carcinogen. It's just kind of like these alliterations that keep hitting me kind of simplistically, but it helps bring it home. That is the point.
Right. Chapter 8, you call them chapters? Section 8? Whatever,
No,
number 8. Talk a little bit about hemp textile processing and manufacturing.
We don't get very far into the processing angle because our focus is really on the in-field production stages. But we did talk about some of the standards that are already in place that would address how cotton is grown in a manner that would help meet what we call our climate plus goals of reducing greenhouse gases while addressing concerns around biodiversity, water, and soil health. So the obvious ones are organic and regenerative organic certifications. There are also 2 other programs. One is called the ISCC, which is the International Carbon and Sustainability Certification, and the 4th is the Preferred by Nature framework. But what makes all these sort of the leading standards that we recommended is that they prohibit the use of the nastiest pesticides, frankly, the most toxic pesticides, and they prohibit genetic modification, and 3 out of the 4 of them also prohibit the use of synthetic fertilizers. So these standards already exist. And so it's really up to companies to start getting certified so they can abide by these standards. I would actually even look at what's going on with hemp production in France. They're not using pesticides. They're not using irrigation. Now, they are allowing the use of synthetic fertilizers, which a little surprised me, but they're already a leading company when it comes to production, and they're not using these inputs.
Yeah,
so it's a beautiful, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the conclusions that you reach in the report?
Yeah, our conclusions were really just that there is a better way forward, and that better way forward is also on the part of governments and brands, academia, consumers, farmers, what everybody needs to do to move forward in a sustainable manner, using that notion of foresight as hindsight as foresight, and taking advantage of what I'll call kind of a virginal state of this crop. Maybe it's kind of a controversial word to use, but it's really, it says where we are. We're at this beautiful, beautiful point. We're at a unique stage. We may never have this opportunity again in our lifetimes to grow a crop literally from the start.
Right. And a crop that has such wide-ranging implications on environment, economies,
Absolutely.
People's lives. Yeah. It's a neat spot to be in.
It is. It really is, if people take the moment. So I don't know what our next steps are. I don't know of upcoming conferences. I don't know of upcoming events where these topics will be discussed, but I hope that our report will start that discussion internally within the brands, within the entire supply chains, within the upcoming conferences, so that we say, let's keep steering this boat in the direction that we want it to go.
Right. And you do make recommendations for governments, brands, NGOs, academia, farmers, and consumers in there. And maybe we'll sort of tease that, and we'll let people will have to go to the report,
Go to the report
itself and read the report, because it's out there. It's a free report.
Absolutely.
Right? All right,
Absolutely.
A free report. It's a matter of clicking on it and downloading it, right?
It's at textileexchange.org, and you can find it there.
Yeah.
But I'm proud of the report, and I'm proud of it starting a discussion that wasn't there.
Yeah.
The discussion to date has been really focused on how do we expand this industry? How do I make it into X, Y, and Z without thinking about how am I going to grow it?
How do we
that
grow it
has
in a
to be
smart and
addressed
responsible way? Yeah.
in a smart and responsible way.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. All right. So I will also put a link out to Textile Exchange so people can find it there at lancasterfarming.com and then get to you and download the report. And so, initially we met each other at NOCO back in the spring, and then I saw you out there in Montana just last week, right?
I know.
So just sort of, before we wrap up, just what did you get out of the summit? What surprised you from the Montana summit?
I think what surprises me and impresses me from NOCO in Colorado, from the Evolving Textiles event in North Carolina to the Montana conference last week, is that there's so much interest in this. There's so much energy and focus. There's so much imagination that is going on. I mean, how do you even think? I picked up we were out in the field and I picked up the one of the stalks and I broke it open and I'm looking for the fiber. I don't see it. How did people find that sliver of fiber in there and then thought, I could put this into a car? There is an incredible amount of imagination that can go into this crop. But again, it'll just be another product unless it's grown right.
Sandra Marquardt from Textile Exchange, thank you so much for your time today. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. It's always wonderful to talk to you and be with you at these conferences.
All right, and just like that, the show comes to an end. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about what you heard today, or concerns, or just something you want to share with me, I am always available to you by email. You can send it to podcast@lancasterfarming.com, or if you want to leave me a voicemail, I would love that. You can leave me a message at 717-721-4462. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. Check us out online at lancasterfarming.com. All right, until next time, I will see you in the newspaper.
Industrial hemp.
Season 3, Episode 28 of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2023 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show is written, recorded, edited, and produced by Eric Herlock. The music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.